Hi, hello. I'm Mike Wolf. I'm the acting director of the Mike Down Center for Indiana Politics, and I'm in the Department of Political Science at Purdue University Fort Wayne. And before we get started today, I just want to thank Will Beeman for producing this and the Center for Collaborative Media and College TV. We have a great panel today, and one of the discussions is very apt to be talking about some of the polarization we see in Indiana and in American politics more generally. And so we have a great panel here of scholars who have been looking into this particular topic. First, we have Dr. Dan Shea, the Department of Government at Colby College, and actually his co-author, Dr. Nicholas Jacobs, Professor of Government at Colby College. And they have recently written an excellent book called The Rural Voter. If you get a chance to look this one up, it's great. We're going to be going in depth. And some of the topics here are the politics of place and disuniting of America, which is a subtitle, which is the title says it all here. And we also have Dr. Kyler Hudson, who is Senior Data Analyst at Vera Bradley here in Fort Wayne. Dr. Hudson got his doctorate and wrote his dissertation on this topic at the University of Wisconsin, which is clearly one of the top places to be studying this. And he also knows the content area of Indiana. So just wanted, before we get started, want to be careful when we talk about topics and talk about different groups in American society and different groups of Hoosiers. We have to be careful coming and how we analyze this, that we don't seem like we're coming from the outside and analyzing people. But one of the great things about the panel we have here together is I think these are scholars that really have an identity and have a feet in both worlds. And certainly some of the narrative from this really incredible work is how Dan and Nick feel their own experience and where they live, and they have an identity with that. And I know Kyler as well, being from the local area, also has a sensibility about this as well. And so before we get started, we don't want to pigeonhole people or sound like higher ed kind of has all the definitional aspects of people's lives. But we want to first start out talking about polarization in America and some of the, when we talk about the so-called politics of place, political science has looked at this issue and the increasing polarization over the last couple decades and really concentrated first and foremost on issues of division on race, on religion, on culture, on guns, you name it. We could keep this list going. And quite often, the literature kind of started on these issue divides and then kind of said, well, people in rural areas have one-sided beliefs on this issue, and people in urban areas or suburban areas are on the other side of this issue. And so we often talked about regionalization of politics as red states, blue states, or gerrymandering, or some kind of type of situation like this. But this is a different, the approach that these scholars are taking are not just looking at these issues, but looking at really the politics of place. And I kind of wanted to ask, which is this? Is this an identity that people have? Or is this just division on core issues where people live that are culturally played out at different areas? And so I just wanted to see where Nick and Dan, where you come at this kind of divide on issues versus where people are.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction and for the reminder that we are parts of many groups. Dan and I are parts of many groups. We identify as many things. One of those things is rural. And although we're always talking about groups in American politics, there's young voters versus old voters, men vote different from women. Of course, there's racial divides. Seldom are we talking about geographic groups. And that's the group that we are really trying to focus in on in this book. And no doubt, some of these geographic divisions are driven by our other group associations. Rural America is whiter than average. It is older than average. But in rural America, often those other types of group associations or those group identities, they don't behave the same way as they do in other parts of America. So after the 2016 and after the 2020 election, many people talked about the increasing age gap and how the Democratic Party was increasingly reliant upon young voters. Well, in rural America, so once you account for geographic divisions, young voters are voting for Trump. They're not voting in lockstep for the Democratic Party as they are outside in urban America. Same with gender, right? There is a gender gap nationwide, but once you account for somebody's sense of their geography, where they live, in rural America, women are actually a little bit more likely to vote for Trump than men are. Dan?
Well, that's a great question, Mike. First, thanks for having us. It's wonderful. Um, maybe your viewers might wonder, well, what's new? Haven't we always had this geographic based divisions? Hasn't there always been a split between those out in the countryside and those in the cities? And the answer is, well, yes and no. So there have been throughout our history periods of division based on geography, but our data, we've got some different data sets that we rely upon. Our data suggests that it was short lived if it was a national process, but more often it was regional. There were divisions that didn't break so cleanly along partisan lines in a national sense. So you might have, for example, conservative Democrats in the South, but in rural areas, but in rural parts of Indiana and the upper Midwest, they were often very progressive. There's a history of left-leaning politicians coming out of places like Wisconsin and Indiana, Birch Bayh, Evan Bayh, out west, the same sort of thing. So it's a great question, and what we find is that there was this nationalization of a rural voter, this nationalization of place-based identity that begins around 1980 and accelerates, particularly since Barack Obama. So back to the question of this division based upon geography, in some sense, it's not new, but the nationalization of the rural voter is quite new in the last couple decades.
Great, great. Kyler, do you see the same kind of dynamics in this direction in your work?
Yeah, certainly. So the way that I think about it is political scientists talk about cleavages, right? And the cleavage of place dividing between rural and urban maps onto the cleavages that you were talking about of these other issues, cultural issues like guns or abortion, or even regular fiscal issues. And I think it's not a perfect mirroring, but it is reflective enough. The correlation is high enough that it's useful to generalize in some ways and talk about rural places as more conservative or right-wing and urban places as more liberal or left-wing. However, I don't think that the politics of place, if we want to call it that, is simply a reflection of these differences on issues. I think it is a distinct concept in of itself. Place does seem to be a motivating factor, not just a confounding factor, driving political opinions. I think that particularly on the rural side of the spectrum, there is this rural identity or rural consciousness, it's sometimes called, that gets at the role of one's identity rather than simply just correlating with your issue positions.
Excellent. And one of the kind of components of issue beliefs is different from kind of the political lived experiences people have. And one of the, certain there's commentators and some scholarship that talks about particular issues maybe hitting rural America in a way that is different and creating maybe a heightened sense of why this regionalization might be occurring as far as the economic dislocation from globalization. There's a growing addiction in rural America, and certainly the generational population loss. Is this, I mean, have these issues and the kind of temperature rising on this, has this created kind of an identity, or is this a separate, or maybe just something more focused on as an explanation?
Well, one of the things we did, because we wanted to get at the heart of the question like that, is we did a heck of a lot of interviews, right? So we talked to, for this book, we talked to 14,000 Americans, 10,000 of which are rural. We think it's the largest study, attitudinal study of rural voters ever conducted. And one of the issues that we wanted to get at was this difference that you're talking about. So what we find is that in some ways, rural voters on policy questions are distinct. There are some cultural differences, but they're not radicals. They're not far out. They're not extremists on most policy questions. As we write in the book, when rural voters are given the opportunity, for example, to vote in referendums on abortion question, we find those election tallies are pretty much the same across the board in suburban areas and rural areas. They're not necessarily extremists. Now, that's not to say there hasn't been a number of issues and pressures that have led to this place-based identity. That is absolutely true. And as we've said, and I'll pass to Nick, it's been both sort of real issues from the bottom up, and it's also been a concerted effort from the top down.
So there are particular challenges in rural areas, and challenges that are universally felt do take on a sort of acute severity in rural communities. Inflation is high. We just went through a period of inflation, but because most rural people spend a higher percentage of their income on energy to heat their homes, to drive to work, it was more acutely felt in rural communities. Medical prices are sky high and growing, but rural areas are more likely to face a shortage of general practitioners who are retiring and not being replaced by a younger crop of doctors. So I think there are particular challenges that are often overlooked by policymakers, particularly in Washington, D.C., and in national think tanks. But at the same time, I also want to stress, and this was sort of an important self-realization in writing the book, that the problems facing rural communities are very much, in some sense, the same problems facing challenged peoples living outside of rural America. Inequality is just as high in rural America as it is in urban America. There are poor people in rural America, and there are rich people in rural America. On addiction, you're right, we paid a lot of attention to addiction, particularly to opioids in the countryside, but there are drugs in cities, and addiction rates are actually a little bit higher in urban America. So in writing this book, and I know Dan felt similarly, sort of came to realize that a lot of the things that divide us are really felt in common. But you might be asking, then why aren't families or parents with children who have addiction issues, or those at the lower end of the social ladder, why are they not lashing out in the same way that rural people are? Why do we not have something called urban resentment, but we have something called rural resentment? And my answer to that is, well, everybody has a reason. Everybody has their sort of the story they tell themselves about why things are problematic in their community. Perhaps for your typical urban person, the person or the people to blame is the 1%, or big tech, or Wall Street. But increasingly, for rural people and for rural Americans, the source of that marginalization, the group that is responsible for all those problems is urban America. And this in some ways makes sense, right? If a key part of who you are and how you identify, who you bring into your group of people is defined geographically. I am rural. Then naturally it seems like the out group, the antagonizers, the thing that is the source of your resentment is also geographically defined, and that would be non-rural or urban. So I think it's issues oriented, but as we keep circling around, it's also very much framed in how we identify.
And I would just add to that on top of it, it was a real savvy move by Republican operatives a few decades ago to help convince rural Americans that the woes they confront do spring from urban areas, do spring from the acts of Democrats. So it was a very savvy move to suggest that rural America is the bastion, the final bastion of what's good, what's real. This is real America. Talking Pat Buchanan and Sarah Palin and so forth. This idea that they are the protectors of what's finally left and what's good in America. Of course, it's not true, but that idea was a powerful cue that added on top of what Nick was just saying.
Of course, Democrats were willing to lean into the same narrative, right?
Yeah.
Democrats were more than willing to celebrate the fact that they were winning in the places moving ahead and losing in the places left behind, as the standard bearer in 2016 relished. It only took me 10 minutes to drop in that quote.
That's a Hillary Clinton. For your viewers, that's a Hillary Clinton quote that Nick stands out in the book. I think it's in there 4 or 5 times. I'm not sure.
No, but I look. There's nobody to blame, right? And it's right to think about how this narrative of where real Americans live, even though only 20% of America of Americans call a rural place home. But this notion, the stereotypical idea of that's where real America is, that's framed on one side. But there's a counter narrative of that too, which is that's the part of America that's in the past, that's not in the future, that's not going to be competitive, that you don't want to live in after you graduate from college. And those things intersect to reinforce this idea of who's winning, who's losing, who's on your side, and who's against you.
All right. Kyler, did you come across this in your scholarship too, or?
Yeah, actually, it's funny hearing that. I realized that I ended up at a similar position. So to me, it seems possible that these sort of economic and social problems that you mentioned, Mike, may be leading to a resurgence of rural identity. But to me, like Dan mentioned, I don't know if they're necessarily driving changes in issue positions to become more extreme. In my dissertation, for context, I tried to estimate the distribution of opinion for different issues across geographic space, rural and urban areas, suburban areas, within each state and over time, right? So if this were true, if these sort of economic or social problems were leading to more extreme opinions, we would expect to see an increase in geographic polarization in the divide between rural and urban places increase over time as the opioid crisis became more severe over the last decade or so. We would expect a greater bifurcation. But what I found in my research was that geographic polarization has been relatively stable over time, even within individual states. It fluctuates a little bit, but as, for example, the opioid crisis worsened, you would expect it to go up, and that's not what I found. Likewise, if the opioid epidemic was hitting, let's say, rural Indiana or West Virginia particularly hard, and that then drives these extreme political views, that's not what I found. Those places tended to have similar views over time. And that might just be because it's difficult to change political orientations or political opinions. They're relatively stable. Go ahead.
Let me just add, Mike, the way we open the book, I think I'll give Nick credit. He was the one who thought this up. So we both live in rural areas, and we drive to Waterville, a small city in central Maine. As we drive in, those communities are, by most measures, doing better. They're better ranked schools and graduation rates and home values and so forth and so on. But to a T, those rural communities are all red. And then we cross a bridge, come into Waterville, and Waterville is doing better, sort of on the move, but has a lot of issues, a lot of problems. But it is blue to the core. It is blue to the core. So something else is going on beyond the policy questions, we argue.
Yeah, and if it was, if this story was true, wouldn't we expect to see increasing polarization or a greater divide on these particular issues, right? If addiction was a particular problem, then you would become more extreme on those issues. But that's not what the data show, as far as I can tell. The most polarizing issue in each state is different. Some are divided by guns and some by trade, some immigration. It's not universal. And those differences don't seem to correlate with the types of problems affecting those particular places, right? And for example, like the offshoring of domestic manufacturing jobs, that doesn't tend to correlate with the areas where that issue, international trade, is the most polarizing issue, which we would expect if that was driving more extreme views.
Yeah, and to Kyler's credit, he's really picking up on something that we've long known to be true, which is most voters don't have the luxury of always deciding on who to vote for based off of extensive research into various issues affecting their lives. People are busy. People have different levels of interest and access to political information. That doesn't mean that democracy doesn't work. It just doesn't always work in this sort of clear cut, this issue is this way and you think this way, so you should vote that way. People are complicated, and especially when it comes to politics, we know that sort of feelings of who you can trust, especially in my opinion, in rural America, feelings about who you certainly cannot trust. Those types of group considerations matter more than issues often do. So we need to talk about issues while policymakers have to be attuned to geographic differences. When we're thinking about the politics of place, it is tough to point to a single thing that may be driving somebody to vote this way or vote that way. And columnists like Paul Krugman always love to talk about how rural people have been duped and are voting against their interests. But, they are longer and deeper stories about how people feel they've been treated, mistreated, who they can distrust, that aren't always wrapped up into a single issue.
Yeah, I think this is great, and it's kind of important to think about. I mean, I grew up, in the Detroit area in the 1980s, or formative years, and these issues that we're talking about, economic dislocation, offshoring, addiction, loss of population. And no one, though, we didn't combine an identity though with people in Oakland, California, right? And so I think the politics of place says something here with what you're talking about, because the combined effect of all of these with identity is really the value added here. And that's, what I want to switch to now is this sense of identity politics, because we often, or it's often thought, at least by most political observers, identity politics seems to be driven by maybe those on the left who are, pushing multiculturalism or other identity-based kind of feminism and other aspects. But what you're talking about really is a different identity that is really holding this all together. I mean, this almost, intersectionality or of these issues and with identity. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more, because obviously a lot of this work has, I think Kyler already talked about this kind of notion of consciousness, rural identity. Can you talk about that a little bit as the important driver here?
Yeah, and I don't think many of the people who write about identity politics from the left like thinking about the fact that it can just as easily crystallize on the right. But this is a form of identity politics. If you have a more critical posture on identity politics, it's, I think, quite easy to see that it is just as exclusionary as left-oriented identity politics can and sometimes has been in our politics. It is very particularistic. It rejects sort of the universalism that was uh, liberal politics, tiny L, sort of like classical democratic politics throughout the mid 20th century, trying to find common solutions for common people and not just pick up on the things that distinguish this group from that group. And it's a powerful motivator, just like we know that other forms of identity politics, but particularly and really almost exclusively studied on the left up until now, have been. So I think it is an identity politics. I don't think there's anything about progressivism or left-leaning politics that makes um, that gives them a monopoly on identity. And that it can be troubling for all the same reasons to think about ruralness as an identity that is the ultimate thing that decides how one votes. Um, it is what potentially limits there being a coalition of the poor between rural and urban areas fighting for the same thing. It is potentially what limits the ability of, let's say, a center left candidate to find common sense solutions on things that, as Kyler was speaking about, when it gets down to the issues, don't actually divide people as much as we like to think. But, when our politics and when our politicians take advantage of the things that divide us, they do so by leaning into those identities, by stressing who you are and that they are, by definition, not like you. And increasingly, that has been a powerful force in rural America.
Yeah, I was just gonna mention, it's interesting jumping off of Kyler's point that almost state by state or region by region, different issues emerge. But these days, setting aside New England a little bit, setting aside minority majority districts, and there are a few communities, rural communities that are minority majority, and those rural areas that center on ecotourism. To be rural in America is to be conservative. So on the one hand, we do have this particularized issue piece that Kyler is talking about. We find the same thing. But at the same time, there is a nationalized identity. Something has happened to create this nationalized identity and all the ramifications that Nick has been talking about.
So it used to be quite common that if we were talking about the politics of place, and we sort of already mentioned this, right? You were talking about uh, specific divisions within your state, perhaps that's what mattered the most. And it may not necessarily have been always rural versus urban, but it might have been this particular area of the state versus that particular area of the state, both of which had rural and urban areas. Um, the politics of place was the politics of localism. And so, surely the rise of a rural identity nationwide has gone hand in hand with the increasing nationalization of our politics. That is cultural, although Americans are moving, like mobility between places is increasingly less common than it once was. Um, Culturally, we are tuned into the same stuff, uh, both in terms of national news, even if there is a regional newspaper, it's often giving you the same headlines as the regional newspaper in the next state or a few states over because of media consolidation. Our pop cultural references are highly nationalized. In terms of our politics, though, too, organizationally, the Democratic Party has become more or less a singular thing where it used to really be reflective of different places. Same too with the Republican Party. People don't split their tickets. It's less common to find the West Virginia Democrat like Joe Manchin and the sort of more centrist Republican like Susan Collins. They're still there, right? So there's glimmers of this pre-nationalization uh, trend in American politics, but they're clearly the exceptions that prove this rule. All of that, too, has facilitated the rise of that national identity that I understand is still somewhat ironically about place and the very specific place you call home.
Yeah, I take the nationalization point, but I think that the importance of rural identity in driving state or local politics might still vary from place to place, depending particularly on the distribution, the population distribution. So, like, if in states where rural residents are politically dominant because there are just a lot of them, like North Dakota or Wyoming, they might not focus on that aspect of their identity, and instead the cleavage might be along some other dimension, like I don't know, farmers or agriculture versus not, or the ecotourism that Dan was mentioning. And I think the reverse might also be true, like in states with a small rural population relative to the entire state. Rural identity might be there, it might be more common, but it's just less politically important or less important for political scientists in order to understand state politics. So I'm thinking like California. There are a lot of rural residents there, but they're just so vastly outnumbered by the residents of the very large cities that to understand much of California politics, understanding rural identity is simply less important. So it might be the case that in the states where that are somewhere in between, rural identity is both salient and politically relevant. In, for example, a lot of Midwestern states like Wisconsin or Michigan or Indiana, where they have a solid rural-urban mix where geography still correlates with political opinions. That's where this concept is most important.
Yeah, there is no rural-urban divide in Rhode Island, right?
There might be, but there's only one guy on the other side of it.
Right,
I
right.
don't care about him.
And I think that's an excellent point, and it's a great reminder that although national politics does capture so much of our attention, it isn't the only game in town. Liz Cheney in Wyoming, though, presents an interesting case. And if you look at sort of Wyoming politics, which almost like fits the bill of not having supposedly this divide,
Mm-hmm.
where you see the insurgency against mainstream Republicans, though, is coming from the most rural parts of the state, including calls for constitutional reform to give equal voting between rural and urban counties, actually going back before the redistricting, the constitutionally required redistricting of the 1960s. You know, why it does make you wonder, why does a rural person there feel like they are in the minority or they're being marginalized But of course, they do if they are tapping into this pervasive and nationalized sense that rural peoples everywhere are are on should be on the defensive, and rural peoples everywhere are losing. And I think that's only going to get worse as our politics nationalizes even more.
So, Kyler, to this point where you say this distinction, and it is ironic that this nationalization kind of piece peppered in here, but to talk about this Midwestern states, and particularly Indiana, I mean, things have changed, right? I mean, Indiana used to be among the most competitive for state and local politics. I mean, the state house was evenly balanced. We had, pretty moderate Democrats do very well in recent. I mean, we talk about Evan Bayh, O'Bannon, Joe Donnelly. And then what we've seen, though, in the same kind of time frame that you guys are talking about, this real rightward shift in Indiana, right? So Evan Bayh, in his second coming, gets smoked in 2016, and Joe Donnelly, a centrist, a pro-life Democrat, gets trounced in 2018. Is this an example of maybe this identity kind of working its way into into real advantage? Did Democrats moderate this kind of thing earlier?
It could be. I'm not sure if it's the rural identity becoming more important or more salient or stronger, or if it's the candidates up for offer, or if it's a matter of issue positions changing. Like I said in my research, I didn't see much change. Issue positions tended to be pretty stable over time. So I don't think it's that there's a greater polarization on issue positions, and that's being reflected in more extreme candidates. It could be that simply the candidate choices are becoming more extreme. That could be due to the internal politics of the parties themselves or the primary process. But I'd be interested to hear from Nick and Dan if what role the rural identity plays in the story.
Well, we think it's pretty powerful. We think it's there. So thinking about the Evan Bayh, the second chance, and I'm sorry I didn't take a look at that before this chat. That's my mistake. I should have done that. But I can tell you we've looked at counties across the country, even into the 80s, 70s, 80s, maybe even the 90s. Rural areas were conservative. Rural. I bet you anything that Birch Bayh, his dad didn't win these counties. They were Republican at the 55 or 60, 52%. But what we've seen over and over, these same counties go from 55 Republican to 60 to 65 to 85. So this is not new people coming in, right? This is not a change of place. This is a change of heart. And if it's true that it's not being driven by these policies per se, what we would say is it is being driven by this place-based identity. And we also talk a good bit about this shared fate idea, that rural people believe that they have their back against the wall, that the world is changing, and their place that they love so much is threatened. And they worry not only about their own place in this rural community, they care about the community. So there is this idea of this shared fate, right? What we find, for example, that by all other measures, you might think that this person would be a Democratic voter, but they're steadfast with the Republicans because they believe that their community is in trouble. So we think, Kyler, we think it's a very powerful part of the story. This identity, this place-based identity, and this shared fate.
So it's and you said, as you mentioned, it's a two-way street here. You've got voters increasing with the identity, and then politicians kind of also driving the narrative about it behind, right? And so it's not some witch doctoring, people campaign electioneering creating this. it's a real identity that's there, but has also been politically taken advantage of, right?
I think that's a nice way of describing the relationship between how identities become politicized. If I could also just build on something that Dan was saying that might help us explain why this rural identity is especially prone to politicization, especially if the issues aren't significantly more worse than they are elsewhere. One of the things that we discovered in the book, because we were searching exactly for this answer, and to be honest, I don't think scholars really had a great answer to this question. There's lots of wonderful scholarship on this, but the question of, well, why rural in particular, if the big policy and issues questions can be so hotly debated and those aren't clear, why is this rural identity really bringing all sorts of people together in there? And Dan and I discovered, and we did some work, just in surprise, the politics of place. We did some work in actually mapping people's places, figuring out where they live and how they connect. And we found that rural communities are statistically just more likely to be to be socially and economically integrated. And what we mean by that is consider the street I live on. Without a doubt, the nicest house on the street ain't mine. The nicest house on the street, beautiful windows, kind of up on a hill, uh, log cabin style, whatever, is across from the not nicest house on the street. I don't think it has a roof without holes anymore, still, right? But I see them talking all the time. They're going to the same dump, going to the same transfer station. Both their kids are going to the same school because there are no school district boundaries to keep rich families from poor families because we got one school. They're driving on the same potholed road. They're part of the same community. And although, yeah, it is an empirical fact, right? We measured it, we mapped it in every community throughout the United States that idea of integration, social and economic integration, is much more pronounced in rural areas than it is in suburban America, especially, but also cities. And we think that's an important way in which this identity is built and is built throughout not just a campaign season, but really multiple generations, usually, of the same families living in the same places.
Excellent. I mean, this is fantastic because I mean, I think the idea of identity isn't it has a political basis and it has a sociological basis that is important to to back it up, that this is a socialized kind of identity. Can you talk a little bit? I don't want to go back too far, and Dan talked about this a little bit, but I mean, we've had these rural-urban divides in our past. The anti-federalists certainly were different from the federalists, and often on the urban. Obviously, if we wanted to talk about 1896, William Jennings Bryan was accusing people of going to be crucifying them on a cross of gold. And even Jefferson and Hamilton, their view of what a citizen should be, what a really democratic citizen. Jefferson always thought the agrarian democracy was the model. Is the opposite of Hamilton. Why is it different? Why the 80s, and why is it increasing? Is it the nationalization piece, or what exactly do you trace this to?
Well, I'll just do a little bit, and I'm sure all three of us could talk about this, but there were some dramatic changes. So there were some of these bottom-up pressures. We begin to see the decline of the family farm. There is a number of incentives, both corporate bank-based incentives and government incentives that led to corporate farming. So farming has never made up a majority, or I should say by the 1950s, hasn't made up a majority of rural communities, but it's an important part of the community's identity and economic base. We see that change dramatically in the 1980s. We see the loss of rural manufacturing, which is a big deal, right? We all know that the decline of mills and factories, surely by NAFTA. We talk in the book about the NAFTA ghost town. And if you don't know what I mean, you've probably not driven a lot in rural America. You know, Maine is filled with these towns that have at the center, usually by the river, an old brick factory that's now mothballed. And here's the catch, Mike, that we've seen economic decline. We see the transformation of industry. 160,000 mills, factories have closed since NAFTA. But very often, a town's identity was linked to that one factory, right? It was linked to that one mill. And when it closes, it guts the town. It guts it. So there were some real bottom up pressures and changes that happened by the 80s and 90s. Surely by WTO and China's admission WTO in 2001, we see the decline of manufacturing. So there are a number of real pressures that come in. And of course, on top of that, you've got savvy politicians. Ronald Reagan was very good at it. He understood that he could tap into this anger and resentment. And right from the beginning, actually, we talk about his speech in 1964, a speech designed to bail out Barry Goldwater. And he starts talking about the federal government coming into rural areas and telling him what to do. So that's just a piece of it. I'm sure Kyler and Nick can add to that.
Yeah, and this, you know, Mike, I think you're right that, and as Dan was just sort of ending with this image of the American farmer and the homestead and the frontier, right? It looms large over our political history, not just our political history, the way we tell the story about America. And we went into this book, I think, with the hypothesis that the rural urban divide did have an historical precedent, right? Drawing on some of those stories that you previewed. But we didn't want to just sort of rely on those stories and rely on those sort of impressions. You know, Dan mentioned this huge survey that we did, which informs much of the book. But the first half of the book is really a reporting of our attempts to count and locate every American voter since the early 1800s and really identify who was living in a rural community, you know, in 1896 and what was the rural vote for William Jennings Bryan. And that was a much more difficult task than we thought. We thought somebody had done it before, but it only took us 2 summers and about half a dozen research assistants to finally crack that. And part of the difficulty, and I think this relates direct, this isn't just a measurement challenge, but it's also a part of how we tell this story of the rural urban divide throughout American history. Part of this challenge is that what is rural is constantly changing in American history, right? The largest city in Jefferson's Virginia, when he becomes president in 1800, Richmond, is about 4,000 people. You know, very few people today would say that that's the, you know, an urban center that he so disdained, right? Philadelphia, the largest city, you could fit all of Philadelphia in the stadium for the Eagles, right? So what is rural and urban has changed throughout time. And, you know, related to that, we have just been a rural country for so long. You know, if you tell yourself that the Civil War, for instance, is a war between an urban peoples and a rural peoples, which I hear quite frequently and have heard even more since we've started doing interviews on this book. Well, it turns out that you know, yeah, the South is very rural. Only about 10% of the South on the eve of the Civil War of Southerners live in an urban area, but almost 70% of the North is rural. That's not a war between an urban people and a rural people. That's a war between two highly agrarian and highly rural societies. So part of the reason why you can't really have this urban rural divide to the same extent that we do now, and I guess that's the upshot, is after we did all this work in counting and placing voters where they truly belong, we can definitively say that this is an unprecedented divide. Um, Part of the reason it's unprecedented is because you're a majority rural country until 1920.
Excellent.
And some of this might explain why this why the identification aspect is a rural phenomenon, and there's not a uh, analogous urban identity or suburban identity. To Dan's point, if there isn't a similar economic base in all of the different urban areas around the country, you're not going to see that same nationalization as you would if, like in the rural areas where agriculture is common or used to be common and has since declined. Another part of it, I think, maybe this is too obvious, is like a lot of other personal identities, it's helpful to be in the minority versus the majority, right? As to Nick's point about rural Americans only being about 20% of the population, I think it's easier to sort of build a commonality around that. Maybe it's analogous to blackness being more important to African Americans than whiteness is to whites. And again, I think that's changing over time, but it's easier to sort of cast yourself as an us when you can, when that them is much bigger. And maybe it's possible that this varies from place to place. Like maybe the residents of Sioux Falls or Fargo really identify as urbanites. I'm sort of skeptical of that. I haven't asked them, but even if this was a relevant identity, I think it would probably be described in different terms. Like sometimes we talk about cosmopolitanism or openness and that sort of being a shared factor, sociological factor across urban areas, or people wanting to live in the big city, even if that big city is, not the exact same one. Suburban identity, I think, is probably less relevant than either one of these, rural or urban, because it exists in that liminal in between space, both literally, physically, and politically. In my research, I always found, like as one would expect, the suburban residents, their opinions on basically any issue to be between the extremes of rural and urban. And suburban is also less defined. It's normally just defined in terms of somewhere between rural and urban. So it would be difficult to base one's identity around that.
Mike, if we give you just 60 more seconds on the 1980s, on that transformation, we do spend a bunch of pages talking about a turn in popular culture. We in 1972, you get Country Roads Take Me Home, you get the Waltons, you get Little House in the Prairie. By the early 1980s, you get a turn. Rural becomes the setting for horror films, and almost all horror films for a decade. Beginning with Deliverance, the story of Deliverance, a very powerful image of rural America, to the rural horror films, to the rural reality shows that we see these days. If you're a rural American, it's the last group in America where stereotypes and tropes can just sort of float around out there. And there's a resentment, and you see a turn in popular culture beginning in the 70s and 80s as well.
Wow, which then probably, again, as Kylie was saying, if you're a minoritized identity, just kind of sticks that a little bit further and makes it a little more, painful, right? And so you have these images coming through, reinforcing a defensive identity, as I think that you're noting.
Yeah, if I may, just on that, because it's now like my little hobby horse. I have never heard, we've been doing a lot of interviews and talking to a lot of people about the book. I have never heard the phrase "those people" used more frequently. In fact, I don't even think it's used about it. No, nobody says that about any other group in American society because they know it's a faux pas. but well-meaning folks who are trying to learn about our research and learn about the other side. I don't fault them for that. Just the offhand, well, what do those people think about this? It's it's just so easy to other rural America because they have been othered for so long.
Yeah. Where does this leave us? You know, it's this point here, you know, as this is increasing in polarization, where does it leave us for 2024 or moving forward? Is this, you know, it's hard to crack the egg on identities. You know, we want people to have identities. We want people to have communities, and we want them to be politically relevant. But it has obviously manifested itself on both sides of directions of an antagonism and a polarization and an othering, as you just note, on all accounts. Is there a way forward? Is 2024 going to be particularly poking at those things, or is there is this the nature of politics in the foreseeable future?
So if I can start, as I mentioned at the beginning, if geography, if your place where you reside remains correlated with issue attitudes and cultural positions and worldviews, I think it's pretty unlikely that this divide is just going to disappear, even if those sort of social or economic issues or pressures that we talked about were to change. So to me, maybe it's worth asking what caused the past geographic divides that Nick and Dan described. What caused those to disappear or change over time? I'm not sure. I think in my dissertation, I spend the last chapter talking from a normative standpoint. If this polarization, if the bifurcation between rural and urban opinions is necessarily an issue, I mean, we have a federal system for a reason, and if we were to lean on that a little bit, then what might happen, what the result might be, is just better representation. If you lean into subsidiarity and allow local communities to make more decisions for themselves, then it's not necessarily a bad thing if opinions differ from place to place. If those places get to realize their vision more fully, it might actually lead to better representation.
Well, Kyler makes an interesting point, and I appreciate it. One of the concerns that we raise in the concluding chapter, though, is the dangers of one-party rule, even in local communities. You know, we think there are dangers. We think there's a danger for representation when one party rules the roost in a very clear, dominant way. So we don't offer prescriptions per se, but we're worried about the viability of Democratic candidates in all these communities. So I get what you're saying, Kyler, but I do hope that even in these small communities, the Democrats are there, that they show up, that they offer a different side, they give voters real choices. We spend a lot of time talking about this showing up, right, Nick?
Yeah, and I certainly appreciate and am sensitive to the argument about constitutional decentralization. It's actually where the bulk of my work is is on, what the bulk of my work is on. And no doubt, right, we've seen changes in federalism. We've seen increasing centralization of governmental authority and power throughout the 20th century, in part because our system of political competition for our political parties has also centralized, right? That it is harder to find that local Democrat that reflects the peculiarities and the quirkiness of their place and can be competitive, you know, in rural Indiana, for instance. And over time, as you see your parties centralize, and right local candidates or representatives in the House, they are increasingly alike one another. You see greater centralization of power, particularly through the presidency. but that's perhaps another radio station as it gets, or another program, excuse me. As we, if I was to think back to the initial question, which I hate not having a satisfactory answer to because I am somewhat pessimistic. I think, and I'm pessimistic because I think that the reason why a rural urban divide is so pronounced is because to some extent it does work for the people that are very good at exploiting the rural urban divide. It helps some people win elected office and maintain elected office. Um, and that's never a good thing because we're the losers while they're the winners. Sorry if that rings a little too populist. But I also think it's tragic that as a rural identity has become more pronounced, as ruralness has become more important, um, people are candidates, especially presidential candidates, are talking about the particular things and the particular places that rural people truly care about less and less. I often like to quip that, the last place in America where you'll hear somebody talk about rural America is in rural America. Because to be rural is to actually be very much thinking about your particular town, your particular community. What's going on in Vassaboro, Maine? Um, we see a rural identity because rural people everywhere is kind of thinking about that. But um, what this leads to is it leads because you a presidential candidate can't appeal to everybody on those grounds because there are no Democrats down ballot in the countryside that can also make that case. What you see is an excessive over reliance on stereotypes, and and cheap sort of arguments about them winning and you losing. It's going to be a while till we break out of that cycle.
And to Dan's point, even if there was more competition, which I'm all in favor of, I think the Democrats in these sorts of places would still have an uphill battle due to the nationalization story that you guys were describing. They're going to be painted, regardless really of what they do or what they say, they'll be painted as part of the group of the national Democrats. Which will be difficult. One other point on that is that if this identification story is true and rural identity is driving this, I'm not sure if identities can change on a dime. So we might expect sort of a continuation of current trends rather than a sudden change.
Yeah, but it's also that national Democratic fundraisers aren't going to give resources that you need to mobilize a highly effective campaign in these areas. The DNC has been quite resistant to even building out something akin to like a rural candidate's desk or a rural bureau. Don't get me wrong. I mean, when Democrats are in control, they'll, at least in the last couple of years, they'll throw lots and lots of money at rural America. They'll throw lots of money everywhere and sort of expect rural Americans to be grateful and vote for them in the next election. But on the actual work of identifying candidates, building highly localized messages, giving those candidates the organizational capacity to succeed, I think the Democratic Party has been quite clear in terms of where they've directed their resources, that this is not a place that they see their future.
And I would add, we would be remiss, Nick, if we didn't mention the second CD of Maine. So Maine has two congressional districts. One up north is the most rural, second most rural district in the country. It is won by Donald Trump the last two times we split our electoral vote, and it is also controlled by a Democrat in the House. So how does Jared Golden do that? We think there's a tail there. We see this in a few places across the country. And the key is authenticity. The key is a true connection to that place, So when Democratic candidates, it doesn't necessarily mean they have to switch hard to the right, move towards the center. We have some data to suggest that's not true. But what is true is the voters have to feel that they understand that rural community. Jared Golden does that here, and many others across the state or across the country make that connection. So it's not hopeless, but I do think that Nick and Kyler are right. This is can't help but be a little pessimistic.
Well, and if I got another minute, it's important that when we're talking about this, well, I think actually we probably all share this, but Dan and I do make it explicit in the book. We're not talking about this because we want Democrats to succeed because we're Democrats. We're not making that argument at all. We're making the argument that, we need rural people's benefit. America benefits regardless of where you live when your political system is functioning. And we depend on that political competition in order to get issues solved. So it's not when we talk about Jared Golden, we're not saying that, rural America wins because a Democrat wins. Dan didn't say that. We don't write that. We're saying, the rural urban divide actually isn't as toxic to our American politics when you actually have candidates on both sides. The truth of the matter is, it really matters if Democrats are doing this because they're not showing up. When you have candidates that are speaking about the issues in an authentic way to the communities that they're trying to represent. And Democrats have just done a terrific job at putting forward some wonderfully inauthentic candidates in rural constituencies these last years. And even if we ain't voting on issues, we can see past the fact that I got good stories, but I'll save them for another day.
Yeah, I think it's important too because I think a lot of this literature grew out of, as we talked about Dr. Kramer at Wisconsin, and for a state like Indiana, where you've seen a switch in the opposite direction. There's probably a sense of people in larger cities, Fort Wayne, Indianapolis, Evansville, South Bend, where you also see kind of to this point of competition. There's not competition at the state level, and this identity then also leads to maybe some public policies and some lack of home rule, some really top-down stuff in the opposite direction that obviously also furthers some of these identity divides in ways too. So I think this is a real issue, and I think you guys have really put your hands on where this fits with identity and everything else. So I can't thank you enough for these amazing insights. So and thanks again too for this program to Will Beeman for the excellent production here, and the Center for Collaborative Media and College TV. And hopefully we'll talk about this again. Maybe it's a happier story as things move forward. But anyway, great insights. I can't thank you guys enough.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you for having us.
You bet.
Thank you.